Revit is a fantastic tool for allowing you to simulate the form of the building and then using that digital model to generate the typical sort of drawings that are required for a construction project, plans, sections, and elevations. One of the things that you have to understand though about Revit is if you don't manage some of those drafting graphics, you get some kind of sloppy looking drawings. And what we're going to try to do in this video is explain some of the things that you can do to sort of disguise that look. So as you can see from the two images on screen, we've got elevations here, exactly the same building. On the left is what Revit wants to give you by default. And after doing a little bit of refining, you can get something that looks a little bit more sort of compliant with architectural graphic standards like you see on the right. So I'm going to walk you through the process here. And this is my after image on the right. We'll come back to that later, but for now, we're just going to kind of focus on what we see here. And I'm going to start off by just kind of showing you the 3D image of the geometry. It's pretty straightforward. My intention is not to show you an actual viable finished building, just really, really simple geometry. There's nothing about the geometry that I've generated here that is required for any of the steps that I'm going to do with the graphics. So you can do this with all sorts of different types of models. I've deliberately kept this really quite simple and quite basic. So don't feel like you have to have this exact type of model on your screen to follow along with these steps. I'm going to explain things that you'll need to do regardless of what type of geometry or what type of building you have. The other thing that I'll mention here is that I've got some sheets in the file already. These are 11 by 17s. Most of what I'm going to say here is a little bit more meaningful when it comes to smaller sheets. On the larger A1 or A0 size sheets, you're not going to notice a lot of these kind of sloppy defaults as much, but it's still very relevant for those larger sheets. But just to kind of make the point maybe a little bit more succinctly, I'm going to be showing you plans and elevations that have been squeezed onto a smaller 11 by 17 sheet. And the issue of the scale, which is kind of the main point here, the proportion of some of these sort of annotative elements that Revit gives you by default, will be a little bit more poignant if we show them to you on a smaller sheet. So I'll be using a floor plan and an elevation on 11 by 17. And as I kind of mentioned before, this is typically what Revit wants to give you if you're not doing the management of the graphics. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to establish the very, very important point here that before you start managing any of these things, playing around with dimensions or proportions of any of the symbols, you have to make sure that you've got the right scale. So go through the process of setting up a sheet view, dragging your views to the sheet, and make sure that you've got the right scale. And that's quite simply because in Revit, anytime you change this scale in the view control bar down here in the lower left, all of these annotative elements, text, dimensions, symbols, filled regions, they're all going to change to adapt. So as you can see here, if I was to switch this from 1 to 100 to 1 to 50, all those elements change. So the last thing that you want is to go through all the steps that I'm describing and then drag your view to the sheet and realize that you've got the wrong scale. And then all the work that you've done has been kind of nullified by the fact that you hadn't really figured out how large your view needed to be on the sheet. So that's the first crucial step. What I've got right here, as you can see, is a building that's roughly 20 meters by 10 meters. And as I said, I'm putting that on an an 11 by 17 sheet at the scale of 1 to 100. So if you're generating some geometry or testing these things out, keep some of those proportions in mind. All right, with that in mind, the first thing I'm going to address here is just that there's a tendency when you're new to Revit, you're kind of fascinated by the graphics, the level of detail. You tend to forget sometimes that when you're generating something like an overall floor plan, you don't need to see this amount of detail. So we don't need to see all the layers in the wall. We also don't need to see any color. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to drop this down to kind of more compliant sort of architectural graphic standard here by switching my detail level to coarse. And I'm also going to turn off this colored shaded view, which is really nice for when you're putting your model together. But again, when you get to the point where you're ready to generate some drawings, it's overkill. So we're going to drop that back to hidden line. And one of the reasons for doing that is that as soon as we introduce color into any of these views, Revit is going to rasterize or turn the view into a set of pixels. And then we get some other complicated graphic issues that we're not going to get into here. But just remember that the standard procedure here is to switch to coarse and then switch to a hidden line display. Before I get into some of these other elements like the annotative symbols and text and dimensions. I'm also going to just point out one other thing that's very commonly missed when it's time to generate the drawings, and that is that we want to get rid of this unnecessary kind of clutter that's caused by the sand pattern on this concrete material. So to do that, I'm just going to quickly go to the Manage tab and select Materials, and I've assigned the concrete cast and place gray material to this floor and also to the sidewalk around it. The reason that we get this kind of speckled pattern here, this kind of donut sprinkle look that we don't need, is because by default the concrete is set to display a sand pattern. So all I'm going to do to get rid of that is click here in this window and then use my slider to drag up to the top and click No Pattern and OK again, and you'll see that go away. So once again, we want to keep this clutter free. It's not really so apparent on a simple drawing like this, but once we start loading this up with dimensions and notes and tags, we don't need the extra clutter of that sand pattern. So we'll turn that off just so that we've got something that looks a little cleaner. Alright, the first thing we're going to start with here will be reducing the dimensions. Now they don't look too terribly bad here, but once again, just to try to clean these up a little bit and reduce clutter, we're going to select the dimension, and we're going to look at its type properties here by clicking on Edit Type. So if I click on that, we'll see that we have a few things here that we want to reduce, starting with the diagonal 3mm tick. It's too large, and that's generally the theme for a lot of these things that we're going to be looking at. The defaults in Revit are a little oversized, and we want to shrink them down a little bit and be a little bit more efficient with the space that we're using on our screen. Unfortunately, and this is again a trend that you'll notice in what we do here, we don't have any way to control the size of that tick right here. Intuitively, we want to kind of have an option here or a button that allows us to change properties. We can't access that here. So for dimensional elements like ticks, we're going to actually go to the Manage tab. We're going to select Additional Settings and go down to Arrowheads, and then we're going to make a duplicate here once we've selected diagonal 3mm. So remember, that was the tick that was used in that family or in that type. So we're going to just select diagonal 3mm. We're going to click Duplicate, and we're going to create a 1.75mm. Once we've specified the duplicate and changed the name, we're going to change the properties here to 1.75, and we're going to click OK, and that will now be available for us to populate a new type with. So we're going to click on this existing dimension, we're going to click Edit Type, we're going to click Duplicate, and we're now going to call this our linear 1.75, and I'm going to change the font here as well, and I'm going to go with a nice narrow condensed Swiss font, and I'll show you where to access that in a second. So now that I'm editing the properties for that dimension style, where it says tick mark, I can now click and find my new 1.75. I'm also going to reduce the tick line weight. I don't need to be quite as heavy as this, so I'm going to change that to a 2. And I'm going to come back up here and make some adjustments to some of these other dimension elements, but at the moment I'm just going to go down here and make the adjustments to the text. So I'm going to change the text size from 3 to 1.75. Again, that's going to be kind of my minimum standard here for a lot of these graphic elements. I'm going to change the text offset to something smaller. I'm going to go to 1. Here I'll change the font, and this is where I'm going to specify the Swiss font, a nice sans serif font here that is nice and condensed and thin, again just to kind of take up less space. That's the general theme of all that we're doing here. I'm going to change the background to transparent. That's another kind of telltale sign in Revit that text elements have sort of a white mask behind them, and I don't want that. I'm going to go to transparent, and then I'm going to go back up here and make a few last little changes to the dimension style. I'm going to change the dimension line extension from 3 to 1. I'm going to change the witness line gapped element to 1mm, and I'm going to change the witness line extension to 1mm as well. Just generally, once again, just kind of shrinking the size of things. So now you can see that I've got a dimension here that's a little bit more tidy, takes up a little bit less space. If there are things about these extension lines and witness lines that you want to change, certainly feel free to do that. There is going to be, of course, an element of kind of personal preference in this. So after I've done that, then I would, of course, just look at other dimensions and just simply change them from the old default type to what I've made here now as my new standard. And I would want to, of course, clean these up and align them and arrange them so they were nice and evenly spaced. I'm not going to do that. That's not necessarily a Revit thing. That's just a general sort of cleanup thing that you'll want to incorporate regardless of what software you're using. And maybe just here, I'll quickly show you that point about using the transparent background instead of the opaque. Whenever these dimension elements or any other text elements overlap with lines, you want to see that line behind. Now, it's not that you want to leave it there. You'd want to kind of bring it back down here and leave it in a spot where it wasn't overlapping, but we don't want to see that kind of blocked out white mask, as I said, which can kind of clutter up your drawing a little bit unnecessarily. Okay, so that's the first and kind of major item on our floor plan. The second thing I'm going to adjust here is the size of the grid symbols. As I said, they again, like other things, are too large. And this is going to kind of introduce a pattern here that is fairly consistent with these more complex family files and types. Kind of like what I showed you with the dimensional tick sizes, you're going to click on these grid symbols and you're going to access their properties here by clicking Edit Type. And the graphics here and the appearance of that grid symbol is all driven by this family file here. So M_grid head circle. You might expect or hope for a button here that will allow you to access the properties and make the changes. Unfortunately, it's not available. And the only way to access that is to just kind of jot it down or remember it. And then we're going to click OK. And you have to look for it in the browser. So in our project browser over to the right, if you expand families, and then within that expand annotation symbols, you'll notice that we have a family file here called M_grid head circle, located right here. Without expanding the plus symbol, so just leave that alone, just right click on the title and then select Edit. Now what that does is it takes you into the family editor. Notice that the interface has changed here, and I see a simple display of just the circle for the grid and then the label inside. As I said, it's too large, so what we're going to do is we're going to just reduce its size. Currently it has a radius of 6.5. I'm going to click on that 6.5 and then just type in 4. So it's now a 4mm grid circle, and the label inside is now too large. So the second part of this is that I'm just going to click on the label. I'm going to initially just see what's available here in the type selector. It doesn't list anything else, so I'm going to have to just start with the 4.5. Click Edit Type, and I'm going to make a duplicate. So if I click Duplicate, I'm going to create a 3mm label, and once again I'm going to kind of repeat steps that we've already seen. So I'm going to change the background for this to transparent. I'm going to change the font to match what I've been doing with other steps here and just make it a Swiss 721 LTCNBT. I'm going to change the text size, of course, to match the title, which is 3, and I'm going to click OK. When I've got those two steps done, so changing the size of the circle and the size of the label, I'm going to click on File, Save As, and notice that everything else but family is grayed out, so this is going to make an RFA file. I'll select Family, and then I want to put this in a spot, either one of two places, either a spot that's related to my project, so in my project folder. You could also actually place this in the Revit library. If you anticipate that you're going to want to do this again in other files, it might be a good idea to put it there. For now, I'm just going to place it here in my project folder, and I'm going to call this my M_grid head circle 4mm, and you can see I've already got that file up above, so I'm just going to make a slight differentiation here and call this the new file. So I'll click Enter. It's now saved, and I just have to click on Load into Project to put it in my RVT file. Now, nothing changes initially, but what I'm going to do is click on the grid object once again, and I'm going to access Edit Type, and here's where I'm going to swap out the default M_grid head circle for the new 4mm version that I just created. I'll click OK. Now you can see, of course, it gets a little smaller. And because those were type properties, they're going to affect any other instance of that type. So you can see my other grid objects now reflect that new set of graphics. So in just those few quick, easy steps, I've already created something that's much less cluttered than what Revit originally gave me. I've got something that's going to be more compliant with architectural graphics standards, and more importantly, it's going to leave me more room on screen to add additional detail and avoid the clutter. Okay, so that was a quick run through on the floor plan. I'm just going to quickly now jump over to show you a few more objects here. This is going to be on the elevation. So I'm going to go to the south elevation view and point out again some of those kind of typical sort of usual suspects here, things that Revit generates automatically that just don't quite look right. First thing I'm going to point out here once again is that we want to switch to the coarse visual style, or sorry, detail level, and the hidden line visual style. Color's nice, but it's not typically used on a working drawing set, so we'll just go back to a more sort of easily reproducible black and white graphic here. One of the things that you'll notice about Revit when it comes to elevations, something that we want to clean up, is that it shows too much of the drawing. So I'm going to just turn on my crop region down below here, the crop bars with the little light bulb. And I'm also going to make sure that cropping has been activated. So now I can see the crop region that it's using. What elevations tend to do is they show you elements of the sort of subgrade features of the building. I don't need to see that. So I'm just going to use my crop frame here, just use the grip and drag up. And I have to get in here pretty tight. I want to see, of course, a heavy line for the grade or the sidewalk or whatever might be around the building. But I don't need to see anything below that. So I'm just going to drag that crop frame up so that it just barely reaches that. I'll go at the top of this set of lines here. I want to get the full line weight, so if I leave it about that spot, I should be fine. And then also, of course, on the left and right here, it's showing me much more of the scene than I need to see. So I'm going to drag that in as well. Okay, so first steps. Change the visual style and the detail level, and then adjust the cropping so that you don't see the subgrade features of the building. Once that's done, I can just go down here to the view control bar again and then hide. And something that is sort of notoriously generated by Revit is an elevation view that has overlapping levels. So that's the next thing I'm going to fix. Click on any one of, in this case, the 3 level lines, and you'll see right at the sort of interface here of the level line and the geodetic symbol, I've got a little symbol that I can use to drag the text off to the right. So correcting that overlap, very important issue. It's a kind of sloppy default in Revit that we don't want to stick with. Having done that now, we can see something that looks a little better, but there's another correction I want to make here, and once again, this is just consistent with the theme, an oversized default element that we don't want to stick with. And the pattern for fixing this is very similar to what we saw with the grid symbols. I'm just going to kind of drag this off to the left here so I can focus on that as I'm looking in the edit windows. I'm going to click on the level line, and if I select edit type, I'll see once again that it's describing the RFA file that it's using for the graphics on this. It's M level head circle. I'm going to have to remember that, so I'll click OK. And then over here on the right in the browser, I'm going to identify, again, under the annotation symbol section, my M level head circle. So this file right here, if I right-click, just like I did before, and click Edit, I'll now see a display in the family editor of what that looks like. I'm going to hit TL just so I can't see my thick, heavy line weights, just so I can go back to thin lines. And I'm just going to repeat basically the same process. I'm going to start with the radius here for the symbol, and I'm going to change 4 to something smaller, let's say 2.5. I'll get a little bit of a warning on this one, and it tells me that there are some constraints here that are no longer satisfied, which is fine. I'm just going to agree to that and click Remove Constraints. You can see it adjusts all the graphics automatically. And now I've got a smaller geodetic symbol. In addition to that, I want to change the labels. So like before, I'm going to click on this name label, displays 3 millimeters. It's pretty close, but I'm going to go a little bit smaller and make a duplicate. So I'll click Edit Type. And this duplicate is going to be a 2, let's make it 2 millimeters. And then I'm going to go about making the actual changes. So opaque becomes transparent. Arial, I'm going to switch that, of course, to the font that I've been using all along. Once again, not a requirement, but just kind of a personal preference there. So I'm going to change the text size to 2 and click OK, and now I'll see my smaller label. I'm just going to select the bottom one. Now that I've made the duplicate for the top, I don't have to go through those steps again. I can just over here in the type selector specify the 2mm label. And because I made these smaller, I can afford to maybe pinch them in a little bit, bring them a little bit closer to the center point, and take up a little less space on the sheet. So when that's done, like with the grid, I'm going to click File, Save As, Family, and I'm going to save this in the same spot, and I'm going to call this my M level head circle, and I made this one a little bit smaller here, so I'm going to make it 4mm. And like before, click Load into Project. When you start to get multiple files open, it just needs a confirmation here of which RVT file you're loading it into. So just a quick OK there to confirm that. And I'll go back to my south elevation view and select any one of the 3 level lines. Click Edit Type, and then replace M level head circle with my smaller one. If there was some reason why you anticipated that you would need to keep the existing level type, then you'd want to make a duplicate here, of course, but that's not the case. I know that I want to switch these all to be smaller, so I'm not bothering with a duplicate. I'm just going to make a permanent change here and specify the smaller level head size. So I'll click OK, and once again, now we can see something a little bit more efficient, not taking up quite as much space or creating clutter on the screen. And now it's time to put these on the sheets and look at one last little fix. So I have now a south elevation view. I have a main floor plan, and I want to put both of these on a sheet. So I'm going to go back to my sheet views now. Here's my main floor. You can see that it's already updated and it's showing me now this more efficient, kind of less cluttered view of my floor plan. Last thing we're going to fix here is just this element, which is the drawing title. And the process is the same. So I'm going to start by clicking on it, going to Edit Type, and in Edit Type I see that the RFA file it's using is M_view title. I will just kind of jot that down or remember it, find it over here in the browser under annotation symbols, and down towards the bottom I can see M_view title. I will right click and select Edit, and there's a couple other little extra steps that we're going to want to be aware of here. In this current view I can see the symbol here, which of course displays the drawing number, and I'm going to make that smaller like I've done before. I'm going to drop 6.5 down to 4, and it automatically takes care of the bottom part of the circle as well. What's a little bit different here is that there's going to be a line that Revit's going to be placing in between these two labels. By making this smaller symbol, I've actually moved that circle away from the line. So just to kind of reset that, I'm going to click on the label and then hold down Control and select both parts of the circle, and I'm going to move them back over to the right 2mm, not 2.5. For some reason 2mm is enough here, and we'll see the result of that in just a moment. Now that the circle's been changed, I just have to change the label, so I'm going to click on label 6mm, see if there's anything available here that's a little smaller. 4 might do it, but I'm going to click Edit Type and make a duplicate so I can incorporate my preferred font. So I'm going to make this a, let's say 3.5, and then I'll go about making all the same changes. So the new font and the 3mm size, of course, sorry, 3.5, and make sure that it's set to transparent. I'll click OK, and then I'll just do the same sort of edit here. So this is going to be the view name. I'm going to start with 4 and see if that's about the right size, but make a duplicate anyway because I want to have the new font. And actually, if 4mm does it, I've already got that one, so I will just change the font. And actually, I'll make a rename this, sorry, and then just call this 4mm Swiss, just to specify that I've got the different font, and just make all the same edits. Okay, that looks good. Click OK, and you can see that the one on the bottom is also using the same properties, so it changed. One last tweak I'm going to make here, and this is again kind of personal preference, but I'm just going to change the justification here so that it aligns to the right side as opposed to the left. And once I've done that, initially I'm just going to make sure that I line these up. And I can afford to have these come in a little closer to the center as well, just because the size has been reduced. Once again, just reducing clutter. If you want a bit of a visual reference on exactly where those are going to land, you could just create a temporary little line here that we'll delete in a moment. And that'll help me get a little bit closer to the final look that I want. So I'll get rid of that line. And now I'm going to go to File, Save As, and Family. And I'll put this in the same folder where I've been putting all my other edits. This is going to be Swiss for the font name. And I'm just going to call this new. Click Enter and load into Project. Specify the RVT file, click OK. And then I'm going to go back to my floor plan, or sorry, my sheet view here. And I'm going to click on that view title, click Edit Type. I'm going to forego making a duplicate because, again, this is something that I want to kind of just have changed permanently in the RVT file. I'm going to change my MView title to the new RFA file that I created. And the last thing that I'll do here, and this is a typical sort of thing that, again, is sort of notorious in Revit for creating inappropriate graphics. You'll notice that quite often we have these extended drawing titles, and this is fairly counterintuitive, but the way that you change that is you have to click on the view, and then you'll see the grip here at the end of the title, and I'm going to drag that closer to where the text and the scale end. And then, of course, this works like a normal drawing title will. So if I change level 1 to something like main floor plan, you'll see that it updates automatically. Okay, and then I get the prompt here about changing corresponding views. I'll click yes, and that's the final look that I want. So that was just a quick run through, and again, some of the things that Revit displays that aren't quite right, that we'll want to sort of change so that we get away from that sort of beginner look, and we get something that's a little bit more compliant with architectural graphic standards.